O'clock. This tour will be given by RAFFMA's resident Egyptologist Bryan Kraemer. Bryan, thank you so much for doing this, and I know you have a few surprises for us, and you have a lot to talk about. So, without further ado, we're just going to let you take it from here. So, thank you so much, Bryan.
Hey everybody, and welcome to the Journey to the Beyond. This is my first experience using the Matterport virtual portal of the RAFFMA exhibit and giving a Zoom broadcast as a supplement to giving a tour in person. So I'm still feeling the ropes. That said, this is all new technology. I'm going to present what we have on display at RAFFMA. Hopefully you can go see it in person soon if you haven't seen it already. I'm also going to show some 3D models that we've been doing supplementary to what's in the Matterport space to allow you to see things in a more intimate level that you wouldn't necessarily be able to see in the display cases. And finally, I have pen and paper. So we're going to be all levels of technology here today. So the Journey to the Beyond, if you have been to see it, you understand a little bit of the concept behind it, but in general, it is an exploration of the ancient Egyptian ideas of the afterlife through looking at objects that were created for the purposes of going there. The ancient Egyptians had very specific ideas about what happened when you died, and they invested a lot of time and money in trying to anticipate dealing with those problems. And the Journey to the Beyond is something that you could see in a number of other museums from the modern world with ancient Egyptian objects, because they created so many objects that are related to what happened when you died. I'm going to explore some of the concepts behind this today, especially related to the concepts of the Egyptian soul and why they created things for specific creatures that happened to be resident in you or around you when you died. But first thing I want to point out is that what we have on display at RAFFMA and in any discussion of this topic, you're looking at a large period of time, at least 4,000 years of ancient Egyptian history. There's necessarily going to be a lot of variation in how people thought about any one of these things in that long period of time, but there's remarkably a lot of commonalities. So in the presentation of the exhibit on display at RAFFMA, we have the full span of Egyptian history at the beginning represented in our timeline, and all the objects represented there relate to an idea of the ancient Egyptian afterlife. They include tombs, they include mummies, they include coffins, they include statues, stelae, magical objects, objects of daily life. All of these things got put into places for the use of the deceased in ancient Egypt for 4,000 years. It's remarkable. So returning to the Matterport space, I'm just going to orient you to how we're going to approach the physical display. If you've been to RAFFMA and you've seen the exhibit, you know that you go in and you actually traverse the area and you look at individual objects thematically organized so that you can see how they relate to the ancient Egyptian concepts of the afterlife. I'm going to look at only about 3 or 4 of these in detail. Talking about ideas that are relevant to understanding them as a whole, and then look at individual features of certain objects to show how they're really interesting in their own right, using the 3D models that we have available. And then at the end, I'm going to open up to questions from everybody. You can, if you have a question about anything I say, or you want to ask more about individual parts of what I say or what's on display, please type them into the chat that appears on the side with the Zoom, and I will get to them at the end. Okay, so in order to understand the ancient Egyptian afterlife, you have to have a model of what they were doing, how they were anticipating dealing with that state of being. And that's a very roundabout way of saying, what did they expect happened to you when you died? Well, the ancient Egyptian ideas of what happened to you relate to their core beliefs about what you were, what was a person, what was your personality. And that's very different from what we have in a modern Western tradition. In a modern Western tradition, especially influenced by Christianity, you might think of your being as consisting of your body and your soul. That's it. When you die, your body's left on earth to to rot and be preserved in the ground. And when you die, your soul then goes off, hopefully, to a better state in heaven, or sometimes not so much. The ancient Egyptians thought that dichotomy was not enough. There was much more going on in this game than just a body and a soul. And so in order to understand things about the tomb, you have to understand things about the Egyptian concept of the soul. Now, the ancient Egyptians have expressed many ideas about what kind of constitutes a human person. There could be up to 14 different parts of a personality, depending on which text you're reading. And there are 9 really big ones that occur over and over again. And we can't illustrate all of them for you today. And so I'm just going to take 3 and show you a 4th. So the 3 I'm going to take to talk to you about today are the Ka, the Ba, and the Ach. And I will necessarily have to show you a mummy. So the Ka soul, what's that all about? Well, if you look at this example of an ancient Egyptian tomb, which I give you, which happens to be based on the model of the tomb of Sennacherib, it gives you an idea of where the Ka soul comes into play. The typical ancient Egyptian tomb consists of a few important places. The most important, of course, is the burial chamber, the subterranean part of the tomb. In the tomb of Sennacherib, which you can visit nowadays, you can go down into the burial chamber and see where he was buried and where his family members were buried. And a burial chamber is not necessarily created for one individual. There are cases where that happened, but usually it's a family vault where you put a lot of people and they're together and there's a ton of stuff in there with them. In Sennacherib's tomb, there was at least 17 people down there with a full complement of funerary equipment. Other parts of the subterranean structure in that tomb are built with anticipation that other people would be buried there further on. So it was really a family affair. And you see that the way that the subterranean part of the tomb communicates with the surface is not that accessible. It's a pit sunk into the ground. It's only really supposed to be used on the occasions of actual funerals. Any other time, no one was really supposed to get in there. The subterranean part of the tomb is closed, it's separate. But that's not all that there is in a tomb. There is the superstructure, the part on the surface, which is much more important for the continuing cult for the benefit of the deceased person's soul. In the tomb of Sennacherib and in many other tombs, the superstructure consists especially of a walled-in courtyard. And the courtyards were actually quite nice places. They're gardens in the desert. They have been planted with trees, and they frequently have an area for a pool to be laid out with water. And they were places that the family came to have fun. They were places where festivals happened. You ended the festival of drunkenness in a tomb, just cavorting with your relatives. It's supposed to be nice. And the other part of the superstructure of a tomb was much more serious-minded, and that was the offering chamber, the place where the cult was actually performed. In the tomb of Sennacherib, this happens to take the shape of a pyramid, and on the interior, there were the most important parts to the offering cult for the deceased person's Ka soul. Now, this is an image that I created that shows a very schematic view of what an offering cult consists of. There are certain elements that you always have. One of them is this. It's an image of the deceased person. In this case, it happens to be statues, almost life-size statues of the deceased person and his wife, who were both patrons of the tomb. It could be a funerary stella instead of a statue. Additionally, there was an offering place, which here takes the shape of an offering table. People would bring the offerings consisting of real pieces of food and drink, and in this case, incense burning in a little brazier, and put them on the offering table as part of the offering ritual. Now, the people who would actually do this could, in principle, be anyone, but certain individuals had much more important roles. Nominally, the eldest son of the family was in charge of this whole thing, but really and functionally, it was professionals who were hired to do this that probably undertook the offering cult on a daily basis. Now, they could have titles that are especially associated with them. Ritually, they were referred to frequently as servants of the Ka soul. And so there's the connection of the Ka soul to the offering. So the Tomb of Sennacherib shows you the basic elements that you have to remember when you're looking at any object from a tomb in ancient Egypt. So what's on display at RAFFMA that illustrates this as well? Well, the first statue, the object that we have on display, is an illustration of the Ka soul. And this is the statue of Hetepheres. It represents a little girl who lived in Egypt's 5th dynasty, probably around 2300 BC. She is represented naked. Her arm is raised up. Her hand is missing, but it would have probably touched her chin in a characteristic representation of children from ancient Egypt. Now, this object is very interesting because it's not just an object without its own history, because we know where it came from. In 1930, the Egyptian archaeologist Salim Hassan was excavating in Giza in the tomb G8988. And in excavating that tomb, he was astonished to discover that there were a ton of offering chambers there for statues, serdabs. This is the tomb with one of the most number of serdabs in the Old Kingdom. And in one of the statue chambers of the tomb, here, this one in particular, Salim Hassan found the base of a statue with only the feet of the original individuals and their names preserved. And this is interesting, and he notes it in about a page worth of his publication. But in looking at this remains of a statue and comparing it especially to objects that were at that time either in American museums or on the art market, the Egyptologist John Cooney discovered that there's a certain amount of relations between several statues, and they all fit really well on top of those feet. And so he was able to reconstruct the entire original statue group of the family of Ra-ware. Hetepheres happens to be the little girl represented in this statue. And this is an image that the St. Louis Museum of Art has provided for us of the entire reconstruction, showing Hetepheres, her father Ra-ware, her elder brother Ra-ware, and her maternal grandmother, also named Hetepheres. So a group like this could be placed in a serdab, in a tomb in Egypt of a high official like Ra-ware. And there it would serve one of a number of functions. It especially could serve as one of these Ka soul statues. And here's an illustration of how that works. This is serdab from the tomb of Chi, which is a 6th dynasty official from Saqqara, which happens to have a nice window showing that there's a statue inside of this enclosed space. And delightfully, around the window, the tomb builders have inscribed texts of the activities that are relevant to the statue in the chamber. They specifically show the Ka priest, performing the rite of providing or giving incense to Chi. And incense is one of these offerings that is beneficial to the Ka soul. They like to be able to smell it. It had divine properties. It's not the only thing that you would offer to a Ka soul, but it's a nice gesture to make. Anyway, the 2 cones that they are lifting up are a way of creating puffy clouds of incense. With a brazier burning inside, you would make it and waft it towards the statue that way. So this really illustrates the purpose of a statue like this as a Ka soul. And so tombs are being built especially as locations for the perpetual cult of the person's Ka soul. Okay, now we're going to go to the Matterport again, step back a bit, and continue into the exhibit area. All right, I want you to, first of all, just make a mental note about him, because I'm going to end up the lecture discussing him. I want you to also visually just make a mental note about this object. I'll show it in a second. We're going to go around and over to this case, which has a kind of nondescript collection of a few things that you might pass over if you were visiting the area, especially since the mummy's right next to it. But it has a very important image here, and this is of a little statue of a falcon. So, what is that falcon? It's not just a random falcon, it's a Ba-Sol falcon. Okay, now the Ba-Sol is very interesting for a number of reasons. One of which is that it has the ability to make transformations into other images, other creatures. And there are a whole set of spells in the Book of the Dead and other literature that describe how this should happen. And so the Ba-Sol, which is usually depicted as a bird with a human head, is not limited to that form. One of the other forms it can take is just as a regular falcon. So these images of birds stuck around objects in tombs in ancient Egypt are almost certainly images of Ba-Sols doing their thing. A little statue like this could be depicted, for example, in the Ptolemaic period, on top of a Funerary Stella from, for example, Upper Egypt. So that's a version. In this case, it does have the human head. Or it could be stuck on top of a coffin. And we have here replaced this one. It's not originally from here, but there are also other cases where similar birds could be put on top of statues like this one. Tasok or Osiris statues. So Ba spirits are the mercurial version of a person. They're the thing that goes off and does its own thing. I like to think of the Ba-Sol in ancient Egypt as kind of an encapsulated idea for your imagination or your ability to wander with your mind to places that you're not physically at. And the Egyptian idea of what happened to your Ba-Sol when you died is very critical to understanding why they did what they did with your body and with your tomb. They imagined that your Ba-Sol got an inkling to wander when you died. It was freed from the shackles of being connected to your body, and it went off and did its own thing. It went to visit places in the universe that you never had a chance to visit on your own. It saw the gods, it saw the stars. It visited relatives who were still alive. The Ba-Sol goes wherever it wants. But the Egyptians thought that in doing so, the Ba-Sol would incur the danger of getting lost. And that was a terrible idea to the ancient Egyptians, because the ancient Egyptians believed in ghosts and they believed in demons. And these creatures, as much as we can understand them, a lot of them have to do with lost souls. Souls that have not been able to find their way home or find their way back to the idea of the afterlife. These creatures exist in a malevolent state. They're not happy and they cause trouble. So the Egyptians didn't want their Ba-Sol to have to undergo a similar fate, being lost. And in order to help the Ba-Sol return home, they created mummies, especially. The mummy in ancient Egypt was the vessel for the Ba-Sol. And we know this because there are many images of this kind of relationship. This is from the papyrus of Ani, but it's found throughout Egyptian funerary imagery. The homecoming of the Ba-Sol. The Ba is returning after a long day, visiting all the places it ever wanted, to rest in its tomb or in the embalming house or somewhere near the embalmed, mummified body of the deceased person. The body had to be recognizable for this to happen. If the soul were to pass over it and not recognize himself, that would be it. It would be lost. And so the Egyptians underwent the efforts and the expenses to create mummies to preserve this relationship. So how did they do that? Well, they did it in a number of very complicated ways, but at the most basic level, they did it by making the body recognizable. One of the ways that they could do this is by giving it a face. So, as you notice in this picture from the tomb of Ani, or from the papyrus of Ani, the embalmed mummy has already been given its mummy mask. The provision of the mummy mask was one of the most important and the latest steps in creating a mummy. It was critical to the ability to perform the ritual of opening of the mouth, and especially the ritual way of ensuring the soul returns to the body. And why is the mask critical? Well, there's a number of reasons. One of them is that the Egyptian idea that losing your head was a way of releasing the ba. So by replacing it, you're bringing the ba back to its nest. And another idea I like to entertain is that the mask is the social part of your body. You can walk around and have a mask on and no one will know who you are. But if you're just a floating head, people will at least recognize you for who you are. It is your persona. It is your social being. So by having a mask, the ba as a social being would be able to enter the relationship that it had with the mummy that it originally enjoyed when you were alive. So that's the mask. The mask is the most simple form of a mummy on top of an embalmed body. There's, of course, another way you can go, and that involves fully decking out the body with decoration, with adornments, and encasing it inside of a coffin. And so this is the coffin of Tadiusr on display at RAFFMA. It's a very typical example of the kind of coffin that you get from the first millennium BC. It dates probably from 800 to 700 BC. We don't know exactly when. But the thing to know here is that its shape is that of an embalmed mummy. Now, I'm going to switch over here to a 3D model that I've recently made of this, and which will allow us to see it in more detail. Functionally, a coffin like this could serve as the landing place for the ba, as a supplement for the mummy, because of a number of things that you add to it. The face is important, but more important is the name of the person. Now, literacy in ancient Egypt is a hotly debated topic. How many people knew how to read, how many people knew how to read their own name is open to debate. But it seems that when Egyptian magic is in play, they kind of acknowledge anyone could functionally writing could work for anybody, even if they're completely ignorant of how to read it. So by putting the name on the coffin, you are encouraging the reattachment socially of the ba to that mummy. This person's name is preserved here. It is Tadiusr, son of Horweja, whom the lady of the house, Ta'amun, has born. And it's fortunate that it's here because this coffin has a number of oddities to it that make it stand out among the set of ancient Egyptian coffins in general, but also coffins from this place and time. And I think it has to do with when it was made and the fact it wasn't really made by people who knew especially what they were doing. And I can talk about that at the end, and I will be happy to entertain questions about that. But there are two things about this coffin that I just want to point out here that are interesting. One of which is this individual who is represented here on the upper right-hand side. This is not a normal representation for a coffin like this. Now, you do have images of women who especially are wearing this kind of dress on coffins. They are images of people who are mourning, women who are involved in professionally or ritually mourning for the deceased person. But the person here is not one of the two goddesses who are typically depicted like this, Isis and Nephthys. We would expect the name of one of them to be here. There is in front of us a text that we've just discovered, and unfortunately it is mostly obliterated, so we can't read it per se. It says words spoken by, and then something D, and then DS, and then something else. So if there's a personal name in there, it'd be very nice to know who this person was. I tend to think that this may be an individual who helped pay for the embalming of Tadiusr, and therefore was being honored in some way on the coffin. And another thing that I'd like to point out, just as a topic to discuss, is whether this is a man or a woman, because that has been a matter of back and forth debate with me and with other people as to what the identity of this person was. And at the end, you can look online, and we've called it a man named Tadiusr, and now I think it's fairly certain it's a woman named Tadiusr. The person who made this coffin didn't make it easy for us to understand. So that's a mummy. And now the mummy is its own part of the personality on its own. It's called the dignified body, or the body, but it especially is kind of the vessel where the ba interacts with the body. So on to the next part of the tour to illustrate for you the idea of the Ach. So the Ach body, or the Ach soul. Now, unfortunately, it's very hard to find images of the Ach per se. They're usually inscribed in very specific places, but the idea that goes with an Ach is represented, here. Now, this is a funerary stela. A funerary stela is an object that you find throughout ancient Egyptian history in relationship to tombs and other places as memorials for the deceased person. In this model of the tomb of Sennacherib, there is represented here a stela. It has the typical round-topped form of an ancient Egyptian stela. That's probably a different type of stela related to the honoring of the sun as it rises in the east, but it shows the shape. They're found throughout the tomb and in other places as well. This stela is perhaps honorific, or perhaps originally came from a tomb, and it shows something else. It shows a deceased person named, Sheshank. Now I'm going to switch over to another image of this that has more detail. Okay, here we go. All right. So this man's name is Sheshank, son of Jedkhamsu Uf Ankh. It is a stela of the late 26th dynasty, so the 6th century BC. Those names are fairly typical of Egyptian names, especially from the north, in the third intermediate period and the Saite period. This is from Memphis, and it's of that date based on, we can say, based on the style of how it's represented, the inscriptions, etc. It shows, however, a fairly important scene found in many places throughout ancient Egyptian funerary objects as of the New Kingdom. And that is the interaction of the deceased person named Sheshank with this figure. Now, who is that figure? It's clear that it is the god Osiris. And that's clear because he is represented as an embalmed mummy who is holding the crook and flail, the symbols of sovereignty, and who has the crown typical of Osiris, the Atef crown, a little bowling pin shaped crown with two ostrich feathers coming out the top. And then behind him is also his wife, Isis, who is named conveniently there and has her crown consisting of cow horns with the sun disk in the middle. Oh, and it also calls him Osiris there. So this shows the interaction of the deceased person with Osiris. Osiris is extremely important to understanding what the deceased person expected to achieve in entering the afterlife. This scene is one of two aspects that's very important, and it is related to the question of what an ach is, because it shows pretty much the graduation scene for the deceased person. This kind of scene is represented in the Book of the Dead at the end of the process of judgment in the Hall of Two Truths. The Hall of Two Truths is this judgment hall where every deceased person who enters the afterlife and goes through. And there they are required to swear a set of oaths that declare that they are free of having committed various cardinal sins in the Egyptian mindset. And they do so in front of a tribunal of 42 judges, and they're put to the test of the veracity of what they're saying by having their heart weighed against the feather of truth, the weighing of the heart scene. Now, should they pass that test, and as far as we can tell, most of the cases that we see, they've passed the test. I don't know of one where they haven't passed the test. They are then allowed to see Osiris. They are brought by various gods, Anubis, Horus, or Thoth, to go and see the god Osiris himself. And this scene is actually reminiscent of being brought to a court to see the king, because Osiris is a king. He's represented this way, and he's functionally, politically, the king of the dead world, like the king of Egypt, except for dead people. So when you die, you are being brought to your new home. You're being introduced, and it's up to Osiris to nod yes or to nod no. If he likes your face, you can go. If he doesn't like you, we don't know what happens to you. So the success of this scene is critical, and it's being represented here on this stela and many other places as kind of a tacit acknowledgement. It succeeded. Shashank's fine. He made it into the afterlife and got to see Osiris. The rest of the Funerary Stella is mostly an inscription, which consists of a very standard ancient Egyptian magical text inscribed on objects for the deceased called the offering formula. It basically ensures that the deceased person gets all, and especially his ka soul, gets all of the goodies that is due to him. Bread, beer, clothing, cuts of beef, good things to drink, everything. The last thing I want to say about this stela is that in being inducted into the kingdom of Osiris, the person is therefore acknowledged as having the status of an ach. They have made it. The word ach means successful or effective. Once you have that status, you're basically set. You get to enjoy all of the benefits of living in the field of reeds. You can travel around with the sun god. This scene shows the way of achieving that status as having moral purity, the end of the judgment. But there's another way to do it. And that is a little more covert. It's covert, but everyone seemed to do it. It's covert. And that is by just calling yourself Osiris to start with. Now, if you look up here in the name, you'll see this sign here is the actual name, Shashank, son of Jed Khansu Afang. This sign here is the sign for the word Osiris. So it actually literally translates as the venerated one, Osiris Shashank. What's the nature of these two names being put right next to each other? Well, it's a hotly debated issue among Egyptologists, but it seems pretty clear, at least to me, from the nature of Egyptian funerary objects, that the person who so does that is trying to assume the status of being Osiris for the benefit of making sure that his afterlife is as successful as the gods is in the myth of Osiris. So the myth of Osiris. If you don't know, Osiris was king of Egypt. He was murdered by his brother Seth. His brother Seth destroyed his body. His wife Isis, his sister and his wife Isis, found the pieces of his body, put them together, and made a mummy, and didn't bring it back to life. That's a misunderstanding. She made it animated again. She made it effective again. It stood up, talked, and was as good as new, although they never say he was brought back to life. He then went on to become king of the dead people. That's how the dead people got a king. That's how it became a place you could go when you died. Mummies, he was the first mummy. Mummies were made so that they could be as effective as that. And so when you made a mummy, you were really imitating the process of the myths, description of how Osiris overcame death. And that relates back to this figure that I showed you earlier. Which is all the way over here. This guy. Another image of Osiris. Now this one is even more covert than the one I showed you earlier, because it's a sneaky way to get to enjoy the benefit of being Osiris without having to go through that moral judgment necessarily. It's a magical way. It's a ritual way. Here's a 3D image of this statue. It's made of wood. It's about 50 centimeters high, about, maybe a little less. The statue is actually made of two pieces. There's the one statue of Osiris, embalmed and wearing this black cloak. He's got the green face. Osiris typically has this green face, especially in the period when it's being made, but it may also have to do with the nature of what is being shown. It's him as a fertility god, a god who's been reconstructed after having died. And he's standing on this wooden block. Now, the wooden block isn't just a weight to hold him down. It's actually in the shape of a brick. And the brick is exactly the dimension of a mud brick used for birthing. And there are mentions of birth bricks related to Osiris standing up. The important point is that he is standing. Osiris is standing on his own power. He is not dead. When he's lying down, he's being embalmed or dead. When he's standing up, he's done it. The magic has worked. He's brought back from the dead. Okay? Now, that's not all there is to this statue. There's also, I'm going to show you a 3D model of the interior of it. Okay, sorry. So that's it lying down. And the interior is this. This object is pretty cool on its own right because it's one of an example of hidden statues that have compartments for hidden books. And these are fairly typical of late New Kingdom, 21st Dynasty. And the books that are hidden in them is usually a copy of the Book of the Dead. We don't happen to have the copy of this one, but it's almost certainly a copy of the Book of the Dead. Now, that's important to know what the point of this kind of statue is, because the statue doesn't have a name on it. We don't actually know who it belonged to. Usually funerary objects have names on them if they're trying to be used effectively for the person who's dead. This one doesn't. So where's the name? The name, of course, would have been on the book, because the copies of the Book of the Dead are completely personalized. They give a synopsis of the afterlife journey, the creatures that you encounter, the magical objects you may need, the things that you could turn into, the ability you have to see certain gods, such as the sun god or Osiris. And the whole schema of that judgment in the tribunal is represented in that book and written down in that book with the appropriate spells. And importantly, your name is placed in the right spot so that you, as Osiris so-and-so, can undergo the journey. And the pictures are pictures of you and maybe your wife and maybe your child. If you're a queen, it's a picture of you. So that whole thing is your journey encapsulated in one document, and it's being put inside, hidden inside of the body of Osiris. Why is that important? Well, it's a nice place to store it, but it's also doing something covert. And that is, it's representing you along for the journey. As Osiris dies in the myth, and his body is destroyed, and brought back magically from the dead. He stands on his own power, has the ability to walk, talk, and overcome his enemies. And if you're stuck inside his body at the time that happens, it worked for you just as well. So that's the nature of this covert relationship of being placed inside of the statue of Osiris. This is just one of several different cases where you draw the god Osiris in a position that the deceased person occupies. And therefore, the deceased person is kind of putting on the costume of Osiris and undergoing the same rites. And this relates back eventually to the idea of the which I brought up at the beginning. Because the rituals that are being recited for Osiris are the same rituals that are being recited for dead people at a certain period of time. And those rituals were called making an Osiris was the great And if you had these rituals recited for you, you too could become an just like Osiris. So those are the three important ideas to understanding ancient Egyptian objects found in tombs. They relate to the parts of the personality or the soul. There is the Ka, the Ba, and the And if you have any questions about anything I've said today, or you would like to learn more about other objects on display at RAFFMA, please let me know in the comments or in the chat right here. Thank you. So Diego, can you tell me what you've got here? Are there no questions? Yes, so this will be turned later into a video, which will be available through the RAFFMA YouTube channel and probably through the website. So in an edited form, this will probably be available pretty soon. So that was the first question. Can I view this again? So where is the wife in that family? Well, that's a good question. And it's because she's been left off. She's named, but she's not there. So Sheshank. Is represented here. He's named here. And then there is a woman who's named here. Now, this could either be his mother or it could be his wife. We don't know. She's named the lady of the house, Iretereru, daughter of Haru. Interesting name. She's the daughter of Syrian. Mesketet. So that's missing. That question, however, may have been addressing this object, because at one point we thought this was potentially the wife. But the sarcophagus, as we now know, is that of a woman named Tadiusr. So we have to postulate a different relationship between this person and Tadiusr. There's no one else represented on the coffin. Another interesting thing about this coffin is that we know exactly where it came from because of the name of the gods. Sorry, there's a question that asks about where the wife is in the family group, kids, grandma, and brother. I don't know what that's getting at. Okay. I will have to check back with you. I don't know what you're getting at with that question. Ah, sorry, they've clarified. Yes, it's getting to the question of who is Hetep Heres. Hetep Heres and the family group. So I will show you this picture, which is from the reconstruction here. And then, sorry, this will be a better illustration. Okay. So this is, let me just do full screen. This is the statue base as it existed once. We don't know where it is, probably in Cairo Museum. And then it fits this reconstruction so that the names of the individuals would then be in front of them on the statue. The beloved of the king, his son Rawer is represented here. His daughter Hetep Heres is represented here. Oh, they did that one. Then Rawer, the official, is represented here. And then, oh, sorry, it is his father. His noble father is represented here. Tishepset. And then his mother, Hetep Heres, is represented here. So she's the known one of the king. So these are all in relationship to Rawer himself, who's the most important figure on the statue. He's the largest one and in the center. So when it says his father, his mother, its relationship is to him. So Egyptians didn't have words for grandmother and grandfather. You just have to work that relationship out based on they're saying son and father and mother. So that's how that works. Okay. Any last questions? I see one being prompted. I assume we'll edit out this dead air as we wait for the question. Okay. Where did the Ba go? So the Ba is allowed an eternal existence to return to its tomb every day, but then it has the ability to go anywhere it wants in the Egyptian idea of the universe. So that could be to visit relatives if you really wanted to see what they were up to. It could be to go into temples and see gods, which is something that not everyone had the privilege to do to start with. It could be to visit festivals, which are a bit like Carnival in ancient Egypt. So you get to hang out and see what that's all about. And more importantly, you get to be in close proximity to the gods as they are visible to the populace. So it's given privileges that not everyone in real life would have had. It's also given the ability to go and hang out with the sun god, which sounds like it's a very nice opportunity. You basically traverse the sky, you see the stars, you overlook all of the earth and the heavens. These are things that people kind of describe as superlative journeys for anyone to make, whether it's magically or as a deceased person. So it's a case of use your imagination. Where do you want to go? But it has to come back every night. That's the one thing. 10 p.m. curfew. So there's another question about the 3D modeling. So the 3D models are being made currently. They will be available ultimately through the website. I don't know the extent to which we will do that, but they will then provide people the chance to look at the objects, even if they're not on display, and even in many cases to see parts of the objects that you would not be able to see unless you were handling them. So as a supplementary tool for the exhibits, we might even make some reconstructions, 3D reconstructions. All right.
So if we're all done with questions, I think, yeah, we can conclude right about there. Thanks so much, Brian. That was incredibly interesting, and I really enjoyed the element of the 3D models. Really added to the experience here. So.
Well, thank you for having me, and look for more content about ancient Egypt and what's on display on the RAFFMA website.
Thanks so much, Brian. Thanks so much, everyone, for attending and for your questions. All right, we'll conclude there.